Emily, you don't belong here. Dad stopped calling you family years ago. My brother's voice echoed through the church just as I stepped toward my father's casket. Every conversation stopped. My aunt lowered her head, but she didn't say a word. Two cousins looked away. Others simply watched. The funeral director took one uncertain step forward, then froze. I swallowed the lump in my throat and stepped back without arguing. That's when the heavy church doors opened, and a gray-haired lawyer walked inside holding a sealed envelope. My name is Emily Carter and I'm 34 years old. I'm a middle school art teacher in a quiet town where most people know me as the woman who always carries paint on her sleeves and smiles at children in the grocery store. I don't make a fortune. I never have. After my divorce 5 years ago, money became tighter than I ever imagined. There were weekends when I taught extra classes just to make rent. I clipped coupons. I drove the same old car long after everyone told me it wasn't worth repairing. Life wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. My family never understood my choices. My father owned a small construction company that my older brother, Ryan, joined right after college. Everyone praised him for following in Dad's footsteps. Every holiday sounded the same. Ryan's keeping the business alive. Ryan knows what real work looks like. Ryan will take care of everything. When people asked about me, someone usually answered before I could. "Oh, Emily teaches art." They always said it politely. But somehow it sounded like an apology. I didn't resent teaching. I loved it. Watching a shy kid discover confidence through a drawing meant more to me than any expensive title ever could. My students reminded me every day that kindness could change someone's life. Still, I won't pretend those family dinners didn't hurt. I often felt like I had to prove that my work mattered just because it didn't make as much money. Then Dad got sick. Everything changed. The hospital became part of my weekly routine. I visited after school carrying homemade soup or fresh magazines. Sometimes he slept through my visits. Sometimes we'd barely talk. Other days we'd laugh about memories from when I was little, when he'd let me paint signs for his business even though they looked terrible. He never complained much. But I noticed things. The room often felt empty. Nurses would ask if I was his daughter because I was usually the only family member sitting beside him for hours. Ryan stopped by too, but most of his visits were short. He always seemed to have somewhere else to be. Dad never criticized him. He rarely criticized anyone. One afternoon he squeezed my hand and smiled. "You've always had more patience than you know." I laughed. I learned that from grading 7th grade art projects. He smiled again. Those quiet conversations became my favorite moments because nobody was pretending. There were no family performances. No competition. Just a father and his daughter talking honestly. Even then, I never imagined what would happen after he passed away. You see, my relatives believed they knew the whole story. They thought they understood who Dad loved most. They assumed they knew every decision he'd made during those final months. They didn't. I wasn't rich or glamorous, but I had something they didn't expect. And the version of our family that everyone repeated at that funeral wasn't even close to the truth. Before I tell you what happened next, let me ask you something. Have you ever been treated like your job, your paycheck, or your life choices made you worth less than everyone else in your family? If you have, you're not alone. Subscribe if you've ever been underestimated by the people who should have believed in you the most. I'd really like to hear your story in the comments because I read them all. And if you've ever had someone judge you before knowing the truth, leave a like and click hype. It helps stories like this reach people who need them. Now let me take you back to that terrible day. After my brother stopped me from approaching Dad's casket, I quietly found a seat in the last row of the church. Nobody invited me to sit with immediate family. Nobody objected either. The service continued as if nothing unusual had happened. The pastor spoke kindly about my father's generosity. Friends shared stories about jobs he'd done for neighbors without charging them. I listened with tears in my eyes, remembering the father who taught me to ride a bicycle and stayed up all night helping me finish school projects. Then I started hearing whispers. She barely visited him. I heard she only came because there's money involved. She's probably hoping for something. Each sentence landed harder than the last. None of it was true. I wanted to stand up. I wanted to tell every single person how many evenings I'd spent beside Dad's hospital bed while everyone else was busy. But I stayed quiet. Dad deserved peace that day. Not another family argument. When the funeral ended, everyone gathered in the fellowship hall beside the church. Tables were covered with sandwiches, coffee, and homemade desserts that neighbors had brought. The smell of fresh coffee filled the room, but I couldn't bring myself to drink any. Ryan walked from table to table shaking hands like he was hosting a business meeting. Finally, he tapped a spoon against his coffee cup. "I just want everyone to know," he announced loudly, "Dad took care of everything before he passed. All the legal matters are already settled." Several relatives nodded. He looked directly at me. "So nobody needs to worry about confusion later." I knew exactly what he was doing. He wanted an audience. I quietly asked, "What do you mean?" Ryan shrugged. Dad made his wishes clear. He knew who stood beside him. He also knew who disappointed him. The room became painfully silent. Before I could answer, my aunt folded her arms. "Emily, today isn't about you." "I wasn't making it about me," I replied softly. "Then stop asking questions." One of my cousins smiled at Ryan. "You did right by Uncle David." Another added, "He always knew you were the responsible one." Ryan nodded modestly, pretending to be uncomfortable with the praise. Inside I felt something breaking. Not because of the inheritance. Because these people had rewritten my relationship with my own father while I was standing right there. I wanted to scream. Instead I picked up my coat. "I think I'll go," I whispered. Just as I reached the church entrance, someone called my name. "Miss Carter." I turned around. The older man carrying the sealed envelope had finally caught up with me. He adjusted his glasses before speaking quietly enough that only I could hear. "Please don't leave town yet." I looked at him confused. He glanced toward the relatives still talking inside the fellowship hall. "Today's not over," he said. "Not even close." I stood there for a moment, staring at the lawyer while everyone else laughed inside the fellowship hall. "What do you mean?" I asked. He looked at the envelope in his hand, then back at me. "I'm sorry for your loss, Emily. That's all I can say today. Please trust me. You'll receive a phone call soon." Before I could ask another question, he nodded politely and walked away. I drove home with more questions than answers. The next morning, I decided to stop by my father's house. It didn't feel right staying away. I still had old sketchbooks in the attic. There were family photo albums Dad once promised I could have. My mother's quilt was stored in a cedar chest upstairs. I wanted those memories before they disappeared. As soon as I pulled into the driveway, my stomach dropped. A pickup truck sat outside with its tailgate open. The front door was wide open. People were carrying furniture outside. My uncle walked past me with Dad's favorite rocking chair. "What's going on?" I asked. He looked surprised. "Oh. Ryan said we could each take something before the house goes on the market. The house hasn't even gone through probate." He shrugged. "Talk to your brother." Inside, the living room looked almost empty. Pictures were missing from the walls. Boxes covered the floor. Cabinets stood open. Ryan walked down the hallway carrying a toolbox. "Oh," he said casually. "You're here. What are you doing?" "Cleaning up." "This isn't cleaning up." He sighed. "Emily, don't make this harder than it has to be. My mother's quilt is upstairs. It probably got packed. Buy childhood things? If they're important, maybe you'll find them." His words felt cold. I hurried upstairs. The bedroom closet was empty. The cedar chest was gone. So were my old school awards, family letters, and dozens of photographs I'd helped organize years before. I searched every room. Nothing. When I came back downstairs, Ryan was locking the garage. "You didn't even ask me." "I don't need permission. You had no right to divide everything already." He folded his arms. "I've handled Dad's affairs for years. You haven't." "I was with him every week." He laughed. "Sure you were." I wanted to argue. Instead, I looked around one last time. The house didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like strangers had already erased us. 3 days later, things became even worse. I stopped at the neighborhood bakery after work. As I walked outside with a small bag of bread, Mrs. Collins waved at me from across the street. "I've been meaning to tell you how sorry I am." "Thank you." She hesitated. "I'm glad you finally visited your father before he passed." I frowned. "What do you mean finally?" She looked confused. "Ryan showed us some emails. He said your father kept asking you to visit, but you were always too busy." I felt every muscle in my body tighten. "Emails?" She nodded. "He wasn't trying to embarrass you. He just said families are complicated. I thanked her and walked back to my car. The moment I closed the door, I opened my phone. I searched every message I'd exchanged with Dad. There they were. Pictures from the hospital. Messages thanking me for bringing dinner. Photos of us playing cards. Voice messages where he asked if I could visit after school. I had hundreds of them. Someone hadn't simply misunderstood. Someone had chosen only the messages that supported a lie. That evening I called Ryan. "Why are you showing people those emails?" They asked. "You left out everything else." I showed what mattered. "No. You showed what made you look good." His voice hardened. "Believe whatever helps you sleep." Then he hung up. I stared at my phone for several minutes. For the first time I realized this wasn't grief anymore. It was a campaign. He wanted everyone to believe I had abandoned Dad. A week after the funeral, another family gathering took place at my aunt's house. Almost everyone came. The sound of forks scraping plates mixed with quiet conversations that stopped whenever I entered the room. I sat near the end of the table. Nobody saved me a seat. My aunt finally asked, "Emily, are you eating?" "I'm fine." Ryan stood and tapped his glass. "I've got an update." Several relatives smiled. "The realtor's coming Monday. The house should sell quickly." I looked up. "What realtor?" "Our realtor. You can't sell the house yet." He smiled like he was explaining something to a child. "I can." "No, you can't. I've already started the paperwork." I took a slow breath. "The estate hasn't been settled." He leaned closer. "You have no legal standing." Several relatives nodded without saying a word. One cousin added, "Emily, maybe it's time to move on." Another whispered, "Don't make everything difficult." I looked around the table. These were people I'd spent birthdays with, Christmas mornings, summer cookouts. Now none of them wanted to hear me. Then I remembered something Dad had said during one hospital visit. He had looked out the window for a long time before speaking. Some people only listen when money starts talking. At the time I thought he was joking. Now those words sounded different. As dinner ended, Ryan walked me to the front porch. "You know," he said quietly, "this would be easier if you just accepted reality." "What reality?" "Dad trusted me." "He trusted both of us." Ryan shook his head. "No." I looked him straight in the eyes. "For someone who's already won, you spend an awful lot of time trying to convince me." His confident smile disappeared for just a second. It was small. Barely noticeable. But I saw it. Something about my calmness bothered him. He expected tears. He expected shouting. He expected me to lose control. Instead, I simply got into my car and drove away. During the drive home, I kept thinking about Dad's final months. Little moments returned to me that I'd almost forgotten. One afternoon, while adjusting his hospital blanket, he'd asked me an unexpected question. "Do you remember your grandmother's old place?" I smiled. "The little white house with the apple tree?" "That's the one. I haven't seen it in years." He nodded slowly. Funny how some things people ignore become the most important. I didn't understand what he meant. Another day he reached into the drawer beside his hospital bed and pulled out a folder. "I need you to sign something." "What is it?" "You'll understand later." I looked over the paperwork. It seemed routine. He watched me carefully. "Promise me something." "What?" "No matter what happens after I'm gone, don't tell anyone about this conversation." "Why?" "Because the truth isn't always in the first envelope." I laughed nervously. "You always talk in riddles." "Maybe." He smiled, but there was sadness behind it. "Sometimes that's the only way to protect the people you love." I signed where he pointed. I never asked another question. He squeezed my hand. "Good." At the time, I assumed it involved medical paperwork. Now I wasn't so sure. As I pulled into my apartment parking lot, I finally whispered the thought I'd been avoiding. What they didn't know was that Dad had been preparing for something long before his funeral. And whatever he had planned was about to change everything. 2 days later, my phone rang just after I finished my last class. "Emily?" the familiar voice asked. "Yes." "This is Harold Bennett." "Who is the lawyer?" "We're ready." My heart skipped a beat. "When?" "Next Tuesday. 10 o'clock. My office." "Should I bring anything?" "Just yourself." His voice stayed calm, but I noticed something. He sounded relieved. Before hanging up, he added one more sentence. Your father trusted you for a reason. For the first time since the funeral, I smiled. The following Tuesday arrived faster than I expected. Harold Bennett's office sat in an old brick building downtown. The waiting room smelled faintly of old books and polished wood. Family photos lined one wall beside framed legal certificates. When I walked inside, everyone was already there. Ryan looked completely relaxed. My aunt sipped coffee. Two cousins whispered to each other before glancing at me. Ryan laughed. I can't believe you actually came. I was invited. He leaned back in his chair. This won't take long. Harold entered carrying 2 folders instead of 1. He greeted everyone politely before taking his seat. Thank you all for coming. Ryan folded his arms confidently. Let's get this over with. Harold adjusted his glasses. We'll begin with an important clarification. Nobody spoke. There are 2 legally executed wills. Ryan frowned. What? The first document was signed several years ago. He placed 1 folder on the table. The second document replaced significant portions of the first. Ryan shook his head. That's impossible. Harold calmly opened the second folder. It was properly witnessed and legally filed. Silence filled the room. Even the ticking clock seemed louder. Ryan stood up. My father would have told me. Harold looked directly at him. Your father specifically instructed that this document remain confidential until after his funeral. Ryan's face lost its color. Harold continued reading. David Carter states that this updated will reflect changes made after concerns regarding pressure placed upon him during his illness. My aunt gasped softly. Ryan interrupted. This is ridiculous. Harold raised one hand. If you interrupt again, this meeting will end. Ryan slowly sat down. Harold continued. The family home will be handled according to state law. Ryan smiled again. There we go. Harold didn't react. However, the property belonging to David Carter's late mother, including the restored white farmhouse and surrounding land, is transferred solely to Emily Carter. Every eye turned toward me. I couldn't speak. Harold kept reading. The contents stored within that property, including personal family items specifically preserved there, also belong exclusively to Emily. Ryan pushed his chair back. No. Harold continued as though he hadn't spoken. There are additional personal assets designated only for Emily Carter. My cousin whispered, What farmhouse? Another relative looked completely confused. Ryan slammed his hand on the table. She manipulated him. I finally spoke. I did nothing. Harold removed a handwritten letter from another envelope. Your father requested that this be read aloud. He unfolded the paper carefully. My dear Emily. Just hearing those words almost broke me. If you're hearing this, then I'm gone. The room stayed perfectly still. I know what may happen after my funeral. I looked at Ryan. His eyes never left the letter. You never asked me for money. You never asked me for favors. You only asked how I was feeling. Tears filled my eyes. When everyone else talked about property, you brought soup. When everyone else talked about business, you sat beside me and listened. Harold paused before reading the next line. I've watched carefully. I've seen who showed up when nobody else was watching. Ryan lowered his head. I wanted to protect one place where your mother's memory and your grandmother's kindness would always remain safe. That's why I chose you. The room felt completely different now. Nobody looked at me with suspicion anymore. They looked at Ryan. Harold folded the letter. That concludes your father's statement. Ryan stood once more. This isn't fair. Harold answered calmly. Fairness isn't my responsibility. Carrying out your father's legal wishes is. Ryan looked around the room searching for support. Nobody said a word. Even my aunt quietly stared at the table. The confidence that had carried him through the funeral completely disappeared. For days he had told everyone I had been forgotten. Now Dad himself had answered every accusation. I didn't need to defend myself. I didn't need revenge. The truth had spoken far more clearly than I ever could. Outside the office, the autumn air felt fresh against my face. A week later, Harold drove with me to my grandmother's old farmhouse. The white paint had faded, but the porch still stood strong. The old apple tree remained exactly where I remembered it. Inside one bedroom sat my mother's cedar chest. I slowly lifted the lid. Her quilt was folded neatly inside. Underneath it were my childhood drawings, family photo albums, birthday cards, letters Dad had saved from every stage of my life. He hadn't lost them. He had protected them. I sat on the wooden floor and cried for the first time since his funeral. Not because of the property. Because my father had quietly made sure the memories nobody else valued would survive. Over the next several weeks, Ryan called again and again. Sometimes he left angry messages. Sometimes he apologized. Sometimes he simply asked to talk. I never answered while my emotions were raw. Forgiveness doesn't require removing healthy boundaries. Eventually I sent one short message. I hope you find peace. I need mine too. That was enough. I spent weekends restoring the farmhouse. I hung my students' paintings in one room. I planted fresh flowers beside my grandmother's porch. Slowly that forgotten place became home again. Dad had given me much more than land. He had given me proof that love isn't measured by who speaks the loudest. It's measured by who quietly shows up when nobody is watching. If you've ever been pushed aside during family decisions or made to feel like you didn't belong, I understand that pain. If you've faced arguments over inheritance, funerals, or being unfairly excluded, I'd love to hear your story in the comments. Subscribe if you want to be part of a community that believes every voice deserves to be heard. Click hype to help this story reach others who need it. Standing up for yourself is never easy, especially when the people hurting you share your last name. If you've lived through something similar, subscribe and become part of this community. Let me know this story meant something to you by clicking hype. And before you go, tell me where you're watching from. I truly enjoy reading your comments and seeing how far these stories travel.